Zendaya has won 2 Emmys for playing a character who spends most of her screen time not telling you anything. When you trace Zendaya's career backwards from today, you're not actually tracing backwards. You're spiraling. Every audition, every role, every choice somehow loops back to Rue Bennett in Euphoria, the character who arrived in 2019 and essentially colonized the next 5 years of her professional life. But before Rue, there was something else. There was a version of Zendaya that the industry hadn't quite figured out how to package. She was young, she was fresh, she was the girl from Disney, and she was doing exactly what young, fresh girls from Disney are supposed to do. She was disappearing. The thing about child stars is that they're not really people yet. They're templates. They're characters you build around existing infrastructure. The squeaky clean girlfriend, the sassy sidekick, the girl next door who exists primarily to validate the male lead's emotional journey. Zendaya played Michi in Shark Tale and Annie Crumpet in Shrek Forever After, which is to say, she was a voice in a crowd, a line or two, a function. Then Casey Undercover happened, and suddenly she had a show. A show is different. A show is where you start developing actual opinions about your character. A show is where you learn what you can do because you're forced to do it 5 days a week, 40 times in a season, sometimes with scripts that aren't great, sometimes with directors who don't quite understand what you're reaching for. KC Undercover lasted 4 seasons, and in those 4 seasons, Zendaya learned something crucial about herself as a performer. She learned she could carry weight. Not emotional depth, that came later. Weight. The kind of presence that makes you look at someone instead of through them. She was still playing the plucky lead, still solving the case of the week, still doing the job a Disney show asks you to do. But there was something underneath that suggested there was more underneath. A thickness. A density. Something that suggested this particular young woman had thoughts you weren't privy to. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because density without direction is just noise. You need a script that knows what to do with it. You need a director who understands that sometimes the most powerful thing an actor can do is occupy space and let everyone else scramble to figure out what's happening in their head. You need the exact conditions that would arrive in Sam Levinson's hands, in a role that was written like a lock and key, where the shape of the character matched perfectly with the shape of the performance Zendaya had been quietly developing since she was a kid on a Disney set saying lines in Shark Tale. Rue Bennett wasn't a breakout role. That's not what Rue was. A breakout role is when you play something unexpected and everyone goes, "Oh, I didn't know she could do that." Rue was confirmation. Rue was the moment when everything Zendaya had been building for years suddenly had a home. She was already an actor of subtraction when she arrived at Euphoria. Rue just gave her permission to subtract more, to withhold more, to let the camera chase her thoughts instead of her words. And because the role was written by someone who understood that withholding was the point, someone who built entire seasons around the question of what was happening behind her eyes, Rue became the thing that defined her. Not because she couldn't do anything else, but because she did this one thing so completely, so absolutely, that everyone else stopped looking. And that's the cruel part of being an actor in this industry. You're only as good as your last character, and you're only as interesting as the choices people believe you're capable of making. When Rue worked, when that performance landed and became the thing that everyone talked about, every conversation afterwards became a conversation about the one role. The Spider-Man movies came out during Euphoria's run. She was MJ, another withholding character, another role built on her refusal to emote in the expected way. But nobody was talking about MJ. They were talking about Rue. Rue was the character that mattered. Rue was the character that proved something. Rue was the character that locked the door behind her and swallowed the key. So here's the question that nobody wants to ask. When one role defines your career so completely that everything else becomes an afterthought, are you trapped, or are you finally in exactly the place you needed to be? The problem with defining someone by their greatest work is that their greatest work has to stay greater than everything else. Rue Bennett arrived in 2019 like a depth charge. She was a character built entirely on her refusal to perform recovery, on her addiction, played not as a Hollywood cautionary tale, but as a lived experience of someone managing a face while everything inside was collapsing. Zendaya played her with almost no external signaling, no theatrical tremors, no makeup department telegraphing the pain. Just a young woman who had learned, very early, that the best way to lie is to tell the truth in a flat voice while your eyes do something completely different. When Euphoria premiered, it didn't just announce Zendaya as a serious actor. It announced her as a specific kind of serious actor. The kind who understands that you don't convince an audience by showing them your work. You convince them by making them do the work. She would stop mid-sentence and just look at someone, and your brain would fill the silence with an educated guess about what she was thinking. And because you built that guess yourself, you believed it completely. You believed it more than you'd believe any line reading, more than you'd believe any monologue about her pain. The withholding became the entire point. The character's refusal to explain herself became the audience's compulsion to interpret everything. This is where the casting gets dangerous, though. This is where one perfect performance can accidentally become a ceiling instead of a foundation. Because when you're that good at playing a character who refuses to emote in expected ways, when you've mastered the art of the pause, the sideways glance, the expression that suggests 17 different emotional states simultaneously, every role afterwards gets compared to that standard. You didn't just play Rue well. You played Rue in a way that made everyone watching suddenly understand what they'd been missing in performances their entire lives. You showed them a different language, and now every director wants to speak it. The thing that's fascinating is that Zendaya actually understood this. She knew what she'd done. She knew that Euphoria had created a specific kind of gravity around her career, and instead of fighting it, she started making choices that acknowledged it. When she signed on to Dune, she wasn't just playing Chani. She was playing a character who spends most of the first film as a vision, literally cast as an image, a face in another character's prophetic dreams, saying about 14 sentences in 2 hours of runtime. It's a striking use of a performer whose entire technique is withholding. It's also slightly insulting when you sit with it, because the film was using her the way Jon Favreau uses a landscape, as something beautiful to look at, not as someone you're meant to understand. But then part 2 happened, and the whole thing snapped into place. Suddenly Chani became the one person in a story about religious frenzy who refused to be swept up by it. Her refusal got played almost entirely as watching. 2 films of control and distance, and then the final stretch cashes it in as contempt. She'd banked something. She'd spent all that screen time saying almost nothing, and when the moment came to deploy that nothing, it became everything. The Rue DNA was there, but it was working in a different context, serving a different purpose. She wasn't hiding addiction, she was hiding intent. She wasn't managing collapse, she was managing manipulation. Then came challengers, and this is where the argument changes completely. Tashi Duncan is a tennis prodigy whose own career ends early, and she spends the next 13 years running 2 men like equipment. She never shows her hand, not to either of them, not to the camera, not to you. The entire film is over 2 hours of everybody, the audience included, trying to read a face that looks like she's being questioned by the FBI. There's no gap at all between the performance and the character. A woman whose entire power is that nobody can tell what she wants, played by a performer whose entire technique is refusing to tell you. It's the perfect marriage of actor and role, so perfect that it almost disappears. Here's where critics got confused, and here's where the she has no range argument started to collapse under its own weight. Because Rue and Tashi are 2 nearly identical characters on paper, both young women who withhold, both managing an audience of 1, both controlling what people get to see. But they demand completely different things from a performer. Rue withholds out of fear. She's hiding a relapse from people who love her.